I gotta tell you before you hire me. I don't work cheap.
By all means, Clint Eastwood is a Hollywood legend, and he had his fair share of awards, recognition, and female admiration.
But Ian, this is a .44 Magnum, the most powerful handgun in the world, and would blow your head clean off. You've got to ask yourself one question. Do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk?
Enough to make other men jealous and envious. But what exactly made Clint so irresistible? His masculine appeal. If we're being real, Clint Eastwood was the guy. You know, the kind of man who could walk into a saloon, say nothing, and still have everyone's attention. Women wanted him, men wanted to be him, and Hollywood tried for decades to replicate his effortless cool. But let's face it, there's only one Clint. So what made him so irresistible? Let's break it down. First off, Clint had that face. Strong jawline, high cheekbones, a little scruff. He looked like he was cut straight out of granite. And then there were those eyes, sharp, focused, with that legendary squint, like he was always calculating 3 moves ahead. He didn't need to say much. One look from him said everything. He wasn't pretty in a polished Hollywood way. No perfect airbrushed features. He was rugged, a little weathered, like a man who had actually lived. The kind of guy who looked just as good covered in dust with a 5 o'clock shadow and a cigar hanging from his lips as he did in a tuxedo. That raw, untamed look, women loved it. And let's not forget his build. Tall, broad shoulders, lean but strong. He was built like a cowboy, the kind who actually did the hard work, not just played dress-up. He had that natural, effortless masculinity, like he could chop wood in the morning, fix a car in the afternoon, and take a woman dancing at night without breaking a sweat. Clint had this way of carrying himself, that slow, deliberate walk, the relaxed posture, the slight smirk that made it seem like he was always in on some secret. He never fidgeted, never second-guessed himself. He moved like a man who knew exactly who he was and didn't need to prove a damn thing. And that voice? Low, gravelly, and deliberate. He never raised it unless absolutely necessary. He wasn't the guy who yelled to get attention. He was the guy who spoke softly, and you leaned in because you wanted to hear what he had to say. Think about the good, the bad, and the ugly. He barely spoke, but when he did, it was either chillingly cool or perfectly timed sarcasm. There's a reason people still quote his lines decades later. Same with Dirty Harry, that whole "do I feel lucky" speech, pure, ice-cold confidence. He didn't just hold that .44 Magnum, he owned it. He had this way of making every single word count, never wasting breath, never trying too hard. Some actors chew scenery. They need big dramatic monologues, explosive emotions, flashy gestures. Clint? He barely had to move and he owned the whole damn screen. Watch any of his westerns. He could be standing in the middle of a dusty street, just staring, and it was more intense than any fight scene. The way he held a cigarette, the way he tilted his hat, the way he narrowed his eyes just slightly, that was charisma. Even in real life, he carried himself with the same level of cool. No unnecessary words, no showing off. He was the kind of guy who walked into a room and people noticed, not because he demanded attention, but because his presence was undeniable. At the end of the day, Clint Eastwood wasn't just attractive because of his looks. He had that rare combination of rugged handsomeness, effortless confidence, and quiet intensity. He didn't have to be the loudest guy in the room. He didn't have to try to be cool. He just was. And that's the kind of magnetism that doesn't fade. The strong, silent type. There was something about Clint Eastwood that made you sit up and pay attention, even when he wasn't saying a damn thing. Maybe especially when he wasn't saying a damn thing. He had this way of letting silence do the talking. No wasted words, no unnecessary chatter. And that, right there, was one of the things that made him so magnetic. He was the definition of the strong, silent type, a man who didn't feel the need to explain himself. He wasn't about big speeches or grand declarations. He spoke when it mattered, and when he did, you listened. That's powerful. Think about those old westerns. He'd ride into town, hat tipped low, cigar clenched between his teeth, eyes scanning the street. The whole place would go quiet. Everyone would turn to look, And what did he do? Nothing. He didn't rush, didn't flinch, didn't so much as blink. Just stood there, letting the weight of his presence sink in. You didn't need to know his backstory. You didn't need him to explain himself. You just knew. This was a man who could handle himself, a man who'd been through some things. And when he finally did speak, it was always in that slow, measured tone, like he'd thought about every word before letting it out. There was no stuttering, no nervous energy, no need to fill the silence. He didn't need to. He knew that the fewer words you used, the more powerful each one became. In Fistful of Dollars, his character barely says anything for the first part of the movie, and yet he completely dominates every scene he's in. When he does talk, it's sharp, dry, and to the point. No wasted breath, no explaining himself. And that made him even more intriguing. Women love a man with a little mystery. Someone who doesn't spill his whole life story 5 minutes after meeting you. Someone who makes you want to learn more. The strong, silent type isn't about being cold or unfeeling. It's about being in control. It's about confidence. It's about knowing you don't have to raise your voice to make an impact. Clint understood that. Hell, Clint perfected that. And let's be honest, there's something undeniably attractive about a man who doesn't need to prove himself with words. A man who lets his actions speak louder. A man who, when he finally does say something, makes every damn syllable count. A man of principles. As far as being a Hollywood star is concerned, remaining a principled man is no easy task. Clint Eastwood never played the typical hero. He wasn't the guy riding in on a white horse, all smiles and noble speeches. No, his characters were rough around the edges, sometimes morally gray, sometimes downright dangerous. But here's the thing, they always had a code. They had lines they wouldn't cross, a sense of right and wrong that didn't waver, no matter how messy things got. That's what made him different. He wasn't some perfect, clean-cut do-gooder. He was a man who lived by his own rules, and women loved that. Look at Unforgiven. His character, William Money, is a former outlaw, a killer with a violent past. He's tried to leave that life behind, settled down, became a father, swore off his old ways. But when a group of men brutally attack a woman and get away with it, he picks up his gun one last time. Not for money, not for revenge, for justice. Because even after everything he's done, even with all his flaws, he still knows what's right. And it wasn't just in the movies. Clint had that same no-nonsense integrity in real life. He didn't suck up to Hollywood, didn't play the political games, didn't care what people thought of him. He did things his own way. When the studios wanted control, he started his own production company, Malpaso, so he could make the movies he wanted to make. When people told him a film wouldn't work, he made it anyway, and proved them wrong. That kind of independence, that refusal to be anything other than himself, that's attractive. There's nothing more compelling than a man who stands by his principles, who doesn't shift with the wind, who knows exactly who he is and doesn't need permission to be that way. Because at the end of the day, women aren't drawn to perfection. They're drawn to authenticity. And Clint Eastwood, he was as real as they come. His depth and intelligence. It's easy to think of Clint and consider him a typical tough guy as is shown in his movies, but he was a lot more than that. You see, Clint wasn't just a tough guy with a gun. Sure, he could outdraw the bad guys and stare down an entire room without breaking a sweat, but there was something deeper going on. He wasn't just brawn, he had brains too. And nothing is more attractive than a man with a sharp mind and a little mystery. A lot of actors stick to one thing. They find their lane and never leave it. Not Clint. He was more than just the cowboy or the cop. He was a thinker, a creator, a storyteller. He wasn't satisfied just showing up, saying his lines, and collecting a paycheck. He wanted more. That's why he moved into directing, producing, composing music. Hell, he even dabbled in politics. He had layers, and women love a man with layers. Look at his movies. Yeah, there was action, but there was always something beneath the surface. $1 Million Baby wasn't just about boxing. It was about regret, redemption, and the weight of the choices we make. Gran Torino wasn't just about an old man and his car. It was about change, prejudice, and what it really means to be a tough guy. Even when he was younger, his westerns weren't the simple good versus evil stories of the past. His characters were complicated, flawed, unpredictable, and that made them interesting. And it wasn't just on screen. In real life, Clint wasn't loud or flashy, but when he spoke, it was clear he wasn't just some Hollywood pretty boy. He had opinions, he had vision, he had that quiet, observant intelligence, the kind that makes you wonder what's going on behind those sharp blue eyes. He wasn't the type to blurt out everything he was thinking. He made you want to figure him out. That's the thing about Clint Eastwood. He kept you guessing. And a man who keeps you guessing? That's a man who never stops being interesting. He had a stylish wardrobe. Eastwood wasn't one for flashy suits, loud patterns, or anything that looked like he spent hours in front of a mirror. His style was effortless, rugged, and straight to the point. He wore clothes like he didn't care about fashion, but somehow he always looked put together, and women loved that. Take a look at him in the 1971 film Dirty Harry. Off-screen, when he wasn't in character, you'd still see him in a tweed blazer, a simple dress shirt, and well-fitted trousers. Not overly formal, not sloppy, just clean and confident. It was the kind of look that said, "I know who I am, and I don't need to prove anything." That right there? Attractive. Then there was his casual style. When he wasn't on set or attending premieres, you'd catch him in a denim jacket, a plain button-down, and a solid pair of boots. Nothing complicated, nothing overthought. He understood that looking good wasn't about keeping up with trends. It was about wearing things that made sense for him. He had a way of making even the simplest outfits look like they belonged in a magazine. He also had a love for leather jackets. Whether it was a rugged brown one with a shearling collar or a classic black one thrown over a turtleneck, it always worked. Look at any photo of him from the 60s or 70s, half the time, he's in some variation of a perfectly worn-in leather jacket, jeans, and boots. And let's be honest, that's the kind of outfit that never stops being attractive. Even at red carpet events, Clint kept it classic and masculine. He wasn't the guy showing up in wild colors or over-the-top tuxedos. He stuck to well-tailored suits, usually in dark tones, paired with a crisp white shirt and a black tie. No frills, no nonsense, just timeless elegance. Look at the 1973 Academy Awards. He showed up in a simple black tuxedo, but with that slightly undone, effortless attitude that made it look even better than if he had tried to be perfectly polished. And let's not forget his signature hats. From the wide-brimmed cowboy hats of his Western days to the classic fedoras he wore off-screen, Clint understood how a good hat could define a look. It wasn't just an accessory, it became part of his image. The reason women loved his style wasn't just because he looked good, it was because he looked comfortable in his own skin. There was never a sense that he was dressing to impress or following any fashion rules. His clothes fit him well, suited his personality, and most importantly, he owned them. That's the kind of confidence that makes anything look good. His sense of humor. Clint had a way of delivering one-liners with that signature deadpan expression that made them 10 times funnier. He didn't have to try too hard, and that's exactly what made it work. Take his interviews, for example. He was never one for long-winded answers, but when he did throw in a joke, it landed. In a 1973 appearance on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, Carson asked him about his reputation for being a man of few words. Without missing a beat, Clint just shrugged and said, "Yup." The audience erupted in laughter. It wasn't forced. It wasn't over the top. It was just classic Eastwood. His humor also had a bit of an edge to it, the kind that made him even more attractive. He had a way of making fun of a situation or throwing in a sarcastic comment without ever sounding bitter or mean. In one interview, when a reporter asked him if he ever smiled, he shot back, "Yeah, when I make money." It was quick, it was clever, and it played into his tough guy persona without making it seem like he took himself too seriously. On movie sets, he was the same way. Co-stars have talked about how he could lighten the mood with just a single remark. When working on The Outlaw Josie Wales, a crew member asked him if he was nervous about directing and starring in the same film. His response? "Well, I figure if the director's a pain in the ass, I'll just fire him." Even in his later years, his humor never faded. When he spoke at the Republican National Convention in 2012, he famously did a bit where he talked to an empty chair, pretending it was then President Obama. Whether you agreed with him politically or not, the humor was pure Eastwood. Offbeat, unexpected, and completely in his own style. That's what made his humor so attractive. He never begged for laughs, he never overdid it, and he always kept that cool, understated delivery. Women loved it because it showed intelligence, confidence, and just the right amount of playfulness. He wasn't goofy, he wasn't clownish, he was just effortlessly funny. And that kind of humor is irresistible. His voice had a ring. Clint Eastwood's voice wasn't just deep, it had weight. It wasn't loud, it wasn't exaggerated, but when he spoke, you listened. It had that slow, deliberate quality, like every word had been carefully measured before it left his mouth. It was the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to command attention, and let's be real, there's something about a man with a low, gravelly voice that just gets to people, especially women. It was that rough-around-the-edges, whiskey and cigars kind of voice, but without trying too hard to sound tough. It wasn't forced or put on, it was just naturally rugged, a perfect match for his no-nonsense personality. He didn't have to shout to be intimidating. One word, spoken in that low, slow drawl, was enough. And when he did say something, it always sounded like it meant something. Think about his famous lines. "Go ahead, make my day." The way he said it, without an ounce of effort, made it 100 times more powerful. He didn't need to overact or raise his voice. He just let the natural grit of it do the work. Even in the good, the bad, and the ugly, where he barely spoke at all, his few lines carried more impact than most actors' entire monologues. That's the kind of voice that sticks with you. But here's the thing, his voice wasn't just great for delivering tough guy one-liners. It had warmth, too. When he spoke in a softer tone, it had that quiet, intimate quality that made you lean in just a little closer. Listen to him in interviews, when he was relaxed and telling a story. His voice had a smoothness to it, like a man who never needed to rush. That kind of voice draws people in. Even off-screen, his voice was one of his most attractive qualities. Imagine Clint Eastwood calling up a woman on the phone. He wouldn't need flowery words or dramatic speeches. Just a simple, "Hey, how you doing?" in that low, gravelly tone, and that'd be it. Women would be hooked. And it wasn't just about the sound of it, it was about how he used it. He never wasted words, never spoke just to fill the silence. That made every sentence feel purposeful, whether he was delivering a killer line in a movie or just casually answering a question in an interview. He made you want to hear more. That voice wasn't just part of his image, it was part of his power. It made him more than just a leading man. It made him legendary. He aged like fine wine. Clint Eastwood never feared getting older. He wore it like a badge of honor. While other Hollywood stars were scrambling to hold on to their youth with hair dye, Botox, and desperate attempts to stay relevant, Clint just let time do its thing. He didn't try to fight it, and that's exactly what made him even more attractive. The man embraced his gray hair. He didn't slick it back or try to cover it up. He let it do what it wanted, and somehow, that made him look even more distinguished. In his 40s, he had that salt and pepper look that made him stand out even more. By the time he hit his 50s, the silver had fully taken over, and guess what? Women loved it. There was something undeniably rugged and dignified about the way he aged. But it wasn't just about his looks. Clint never acted old either. He didn't try to dress like a 20-year-old, but he also didn't start shuffling around in slippers complaining about kids these days. He stayed active, kept working, and continued evolving. That's why women still found him sexy well into his 60s, 70s, and even beyond. Look at him in Unforgiven. He was pushing 60, playing a grizzled ex-gunslinger, and somehow he was still one of the coolest guys on screen. Then came $1 Million Baby in his 70s, where he played an old, worn-out boxing trainer with more soul and depth than most young actors could ever pull off. By Gran Torino, he was nearly 80, playing an aging war veteran, and he still had more presence than actors half his age. And that's the thing, he never became a parody of himself. Some aging stars try to cling to what made them famous, forcing their old tricks long past their prime. Not Clint. He let himself grow into new roles, new challenges, and new versions of himself. He didn't try to be Dirty Harry forever. He evolved. Women love a man who doesn't fight time but grows into it, a man who doesn't get bitter about aging but instead embraces it with confidence. That's exactly what Clint did. He aged like fine whiskey, stronger, smoother, and even more powerful with time. Never dwelt on past. Clint Eastwood wasn't the kind of guy to sit around reminiscing about the good old days. He didn't waste time wishing things were like they used to be or complaining about how the world had changed. Instead, he kept moving forward, always working, always evolving, always looking ahead. Even when he had every reason to sit back and live off his past success, he didn't. He could have retired comfortably after Dirty Harry or Unforgiven, but instead he kept pushing himself. In his 70s, he made $1 Million Baby, a film that won Best Picture. In his 80s, he starred in and directed Gran Torino, proving that he still had that same presence and command. And well into his 90s, he was still making movies, still telling new stories, still refusing to fade into the background. That kind of mindset is attractive. Women love a man who doesn't cling to the past, but instead embraces what's next. A man who doesn't constantly bring up what he used to do, but is still doing something. It shows confidence, drive, and a love for life that doesn't diminish with time. Clint didn't need to remind people of his past greatness. He was too busy creating new moments of greatness. That's what made him stand out. That's what made him timeless.